Hello and welcome to a conversation on the Daily Bern. I'm your host, Eric Miller. I'm joined today by a fierce and fiery progressive from the great state of California, Jackie Fielder. How you doing, Jackie?
Good. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for taking some time to chat with me. Apologize for being a minute or two late. My internet went down. Got a storm here, so in case this gets disconnected, that'll be the reason why. So hopefully it'll last. I learned about you. I guess you started your campaign about a year ago. There was a fantastic piece in Teen Vogue. I remember seeing it at the time. And well, you're just a tried and true activist. And I want to talk about sort of your background and what inspired you to run, what issues are sort of planks in your platform and so forth. But just back to the beginning, what motivated you, to move from activism into, electoral politics, and maybe in that answer, give a little bit of background about your activism.
Yeah, so it all starts for me back actually in my home territories during the Standing Rock's No Dakota Access Pipeline movement. So I had at that point already been politicized by the Black Lives Matter movement, which I experienced as an undergraduate at Stanford, marching through the streets of Palo Alto with my classmates. And at that point, I had been a police accountability activist looking at the flows of money from law enforcement unions who are so opposed at every single step of the way to police accountability and decarceration efforts, and their link to candidates for political office here in our state of California. And so when I saw my own relatives face down the barrel of guns, face militarized law enforcement, as they were peacefully protesting on our own ancestral territories, and also having dogs sit on them and literally pierce their flesh, having water cannons unleashed on them in sub-freezing temperatures, that really personalized the issue of police violence for me. And so I visited the Standing Rock Reservation in December of 2019. Both of my grandparents grew up on reservations in North and South Dakota, and their homes are affected by the pipeline. This pipeline goes through the Missouri River, which is the only source of fresh water for thousands of people, not just Indigenous people on the reservations, but people out there too. And so after I came back to San Francisco, I wanted to see if we could divest our city monies from the multitude of banks that invest in pipelines and prisons and weapons manufacturing, and instead reinvest in our own public bank that could finance things that we actually need, like affordable housing, renewable energy, public infrastructure, small businesses. And so since then, I have been working with a coalition of organizations here on the ground in San Francisco for the past few years. Last year, we passed with our partners up and down the state as part of the California Public Banking Alliance, AB 857, which created a pathway for local agencies to create their own public banks. So that was a first big step, was to create the option to create a public bank. And now we also are pushing for AB 310, which is a piece of legislation to create a state bank. This wouldn't be a replacement for the local banks. It would be basically the foundation of an array of public banking, kind of like how Germany has. And so, fast forward to 2019, I have been living in San Francisco and seeing so many of my friends, fellow organizers, and even my family who lives in California, in Southern California, facing such grueling circumstances when it comes to working day in and day out and just living paycheck to paycheck. I even was sleeping in my own van and couch surfing for some months last year because it's just so expensive. We have 175 billionaires in the state of California. We have one of the highest poverty rates in the nation, actually, next to Florida and Louisiana. We have some of the lowest per student spending in our public schools, and we are the 5th largest economy in the world. And on top of all of that, we have only one renter in the whole state legislature, in a state where 45% of people are renting. California has just been for sale for too long to real estate interests, to fossil fuel interests, to big tech company interests now. And these forces threaten our very basic dignity. They also spur more policing and incarceration, and there's an increasing stratification of income when it comes to even this district. You know, you can be in the Bayview, which is one of the last Black strongholds in our district, and then go across the freeway to a predominantly white neighborhood, and the median income can be, you know, quadruple that. And so the wealth inequalities are so stark here, and I was just tired of seeing the same old politicians just kind of do nothing. We have a Democratic supermajority. There is a national movement to put people into office that are beholden to everyday people instead of corporations and special interests. And here in District 11, we have seen some of these progressive candidates, even a Democratic Socialist supervisor, Dean Preston, get elected to our local board of supervisors. I thought it was just time that we aim for the top and that we get someone in the state legislature who we know will consistently be on the side of workers, renters, the disabled, elderly, people of color, working class people.
Yeah, that's amazing. You mentioned a lot in there, and there's a lot of that I kind of want to hit on, but we don't have an infinite amount of time. Maybe we can talk again later. But I know California housing is a thing in San Francisco, especially. Rent prices are really high. Can you talk about your plan for housing for all in California? I think that's something you're running on.
Yeah, I'm running on a homes guarantee, and what that means is essentially, I'm not accepting contributions from the real estate lobby or the landlord lobby. I think especially in this pandemic, our platform, it hasn't changed much. We are still advocating for things like a universal right to counsel for anyone facing eviction. We've seen such success with that here in San Francisco, and disproportionately benefiting low-income people and Black people and other communities of color. So I want to expand that to the state level. I also want a $100 billion California housing emergency fund. The dominant conversation around housing here in California, I would say by establishment interests and the real estate lobby even, are myopically focused on deregulating our housing policies. So, cutting particular legislation around, density limits and so on, which my opponent has been a huge champion on. His biggest flagship legislation was SB 50. The thing is, the problem has been so clear for displaced communities and communities sensitive to gentrification is that the problem isn't they are not building enough housing in those areas. They're not building housing for the people who need it most. They're not building housing for the people who are threatened by displacement and the rising cost of living. And so I am all for building more affordable housing. It's just who gets to define affordable? And for a long time, the real estate lobby, who is trying to maximize their profits, big tech companies who have been trying to get their workers, housed over here, they're advocating for housing for really people who can afford a bedroom apartment for, more than $2,000. That is not the case for the majority of working Californians. And so I really want a fund for affordable housing to build 100,000 new units of public and social housing, and also to take 200,000 units off of the speculative market entirely. And we know we are going to face a wave of evictions and foreclosures. And instead of focusing myopically on deregulating our housing policies, the state legislature should have been focusing on expanding protections for tenants and for small homeowners who are now facing eviction and foreclosures.
Right. And you mentioned your opponent. He's a beneficiary of the real estate lobby, if not a full-blown puppet. It's Scott Wiener, right?
Yeah. Senator Scott Wiener is the most real estate-backed politician in the whole California legislature, has long sided with real estate interests, even in his own district, against the wishes and interests of anti-displacement activists, tenants' rights organizers, and many others.
Right on. I want to show your district just briefly, and pull up your website, because your website is, and I want to give you a compliment as we pull that up too. Because districts are intentionally, sometimes they're intentionally, vaguely drawn or gerrymandered in a ridiculous way. It's a passive way for voter suppression. So I always like to show the districts so people know what we're talking about and say, hey, that's me. I'm in there, right? So your district here's, this is a state Senate seat, District 11. This is the entirety of San Francisco, right?
Yes.
Can you talk about, can you just talk a little bit about your district? Anything you want to highlight about this?
Yeah, it's all of San Francisco, but it's also all of a couple cities to the south of us, Daly City, as well as Colma. There's Broadmoor, which is a small enclave of its own, and parts of northern South San Francisco. South San Francisco is a completely different city. The thing is, this kind of districting really leaves behind Daly City usually, and the parts that are not in San Francisco. San Francisco is also actually a county. So that southern part of the district is chipping off parts of San Mateo County. And so, especially when it comes to schools and public schools and legislation at the state level, because, these school districts in this particular south end of the district are cut off or at the intersection of multiple districts at the state level, you would think that they would get more attention, but they actually get less. And so the interests of San Francisco, unfortunately, sometimes dominate those of the non-San Francisco parts. But in any sense, I think that's and quite frankly really messed up. But that's why we are reaching out proactively to people in the non-San Francisco parts. And so many of them, I can't tell you how many people just say, no one has ever called me. I've never heard from a politician. And it obviously makes me feel relief that we're reaching out to them. And I'm always glad to connect with the voters. But when they say that, you just feel so heartbroken for how our politics has been set up for people to not participate and not feel included. And that's something that we're trying to change with this campaign.
Right on. Yeah, I want to hit on how you're being received, but since I'm sharing your website, I just want to highlight your platform is on here. It's very explicitly detailed, but man, you have endorsements out the wazoo. It's an impressive list. I think this is, if you get a vote from everybody that's on this endorsement list, you should win no problem, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's an amazing, I feel very honored to have the support of even the California Teachers Association. It is a big deal for a labor organization to come out against an incumbent. And so to have one of the most powerful lobbies for teachers in our state backing my campaign, it goes to show you, one, I'm an educator at San Francisco State. Of course, I would advocate for our students and for teachers. But two, my opponent has been a huge champion for charter schools and has even become an award winner among the California Charter School Association. And so, the local San Francisco educators union, as well as the California Teachers Association, have endorsed my campaign, as have the City College Faculty Union and my own union dual endorsed myself and my opponent, the California Faculty Association, which represents faculty at the various state universities across the state of California. And in addition to that, we're backed by the local tenants union, San Francisco Tenants Union, a number of elected officials, supervisors, 4 supervisors, including one, Dean Preston from my fellow, he's also a fellow Democratic Socialists of America member of our local chapter, been endorsed by both our local DSA and our national chapters. So I'm really honored to have that as well.
Right on. Yeah, some good groups and individuals on that list for sure. Go check it out on Jackie's website. What are the challenges, right? So there's this constant struggle of sort of a grassroots campaign versus an incumbent with, lobbyist money and so forth. And you mentioned, hitting some constituents in the south part of your district that doors have never been knocked, right? Obviously, we're in a pandemic, and that favors the big money campaign a little bit, right? However, in the primary, which was in March, I believe, you really closed the gap, right? I don't know what the baseline was, but you certainly closed the gap, and the general is just you against Scott in November. So you kind of have a baseline, and you know what you have to sort of get to, right? How is campaigning going, and how are you engaging? What's the outreach program?
Yeah, our district is unique for so many different reasons. One is the state Senate has only 40 senators. For California's population of roughly 40 million people, that means each senator represents roughly 930,000 people, almost a million. Our districts are gigantic. At the same time, here in San Francisco, relative to other places in the country, we have a high voter turnout. So in our primary, we got 99,000 votes, and that amounts to 33% of the electorate. In California, for the state level races, we have a top two system. So in our primaries, whoever gets first and second place moves on to November, no matter their party. And so that's why I'm able to move on to November, is because I got second place. And with only 50 days to campaign on the ground earlier this year, we didn't have much time to get the word out about the campaign. And even then, we still got 33%. The third candidate, a Republican candidate, got only 11%, which is pretty typical. And then my opponent, the incumbent, Scott Wiener, received a little less than 56%, which is not a mandate for a senator who has been productive, although I would say productive for the wrong interests most of the time. And he's got a 15-year political career. I've had a career of 7 or 8 months now. And it's a grassroots campaign. It can't get any more David and Goliath. When I started and announced this campaign, he had already had $1.3 million in the bank, and I had zero. But since then, we've actually been able to raise almost $400,000, and that is 90% of those are coming from contributions that are less than $100. And so, campaigning coronavirus, we have been kind of scared about, how are we going to do this talking to voters one-on-one, because that's our main strategy. Reaching out to, yes, the non-San Francisco parts of our district especially, but also parts of San Francisco that have been historically ignored, like, the historically Black strongholds in our city, the, Latino districts in our city. And, it's been amazing to hear the feedback from people that I talk to on the phone. I talk to voters now almost every day, and they're all shocked. They're like, wait, is this you or a machine? Or they ask me, I've just never been called by a politician before. What are you about? And I get to talk to them about, how we need someone in the state legislature who knows what it's like to struggle right now, especially right now. And so the reception is overwhelming. And really, I expected to get 20% in the primary. And so 33% was just earth-shattering for everyone, including myself. And we only have 75 days until ballots drop. All registered voters in California are receiving a ballot in the mail. And so we're relying primarily on phone banking, calling 4,000 to 5,000 voters every single week, and distributing our literature to people's doors, which people often confuse for mail, but we hand deliver it,
Right.
with adequate PP and everything.
Right. How about, have you noticed him becoming any less complacent now that you're sort of nipping at his heels for November? Any chance of a debate even?
Oh yeah, we would love the debate, and we tried, and from his end, it seems like he wants to delay as much as possible, but we're trying to make it happen. And yeah, earlier in June, I challenged him to reject law enforcement contributions. he had received more than $72,000 from law enforcement unions up and down the state, not just here in San Francisco or the district. He had received that much going back to 2015 in his first state Senate campaign. And so he actually conceded. That was the first time he acknowledged our campaign in public. It's a big deal, especially for an insurgent candidate like myself. And, you know, it showed that he was so desperate and clearly on the wrong side of history, as we're seeing all these protests against police violence. And clearly, you know, even in his own district, those have been affecting his stances on things. I ran the No on H campaign, which was an opposition to campaign to the local San Francisco Police Officers Association. And he was on their side. So was the local Republican Party when they wanted to write their own dangerous use of force policy. But what did we do? We got organized. We were outspent 10-1, but we claimed victory with over 60% of voters voting that measure down. And so that's just one example. He's had an entire career of advocating for the criminalization of homelessness, enhanced sentencing for victimless crimes even, and advocating for more law enforcement funding. And this is a time when we clearly can't trust law enforcement to spend our money on reforms that work. And so we need to invest in real community stability, like single-payer healthcare, clean air and water, and a Green New Deal, public education, and actually making sure that our system of education in California is the best in the country. There are so many things where he has been on the wrong side of his own constituents, and it's time to actually have someone to be on the side of constituents 100% of the time, not just when it's politically convenient, not just when it's popular, but when it is necessary.
Right on. I'm just going to pull up. I think we hit on most of these issues, but I just want to pull it up. You know, you mentioned about the redirecting police funding, minimum wage. We sort of danced around getting money out of politics to guarantee housing. Maybe let's hit on the Green Deal as it relates to your district. I'm assuming that tourism is a big industry there, maybe fishing or things like that. The Green New Deal, obviously, climate change would have a very deleterious effect on your district. Can you talk about, you know, what that means to your district and what a just transition? And I think there's actually a Green New Deal for California specific initiative.
Yeah, there's a lot being floated around. I did have a hand in writing a piece in the state level resolution for a Green New Deal in California. I wrote the part about Indigenous stewardship and honoring Indigenous people's right to self-determine how they conduct their affairs, especially how they deal with their own lands. And so I want a Green New Deal for California. And what that means to me, especially as a kid who was raised in a predominantly low-income neighborhood, I had asthma growing up, and so did so many of my neighbors and cousins. That's just kind of the thing you get used to when you're born and raised in LA. You also get used to the fossil fuel infrastructure just being a part of the landscape. I surf, I grew up surfing, still surf here in the district, but it's not uncommon to see oil drilling off of the gorgeous shores up and down California. And even in this coronavirus pandemic, Governor Newsom has approved a number of permits to construct new fossil fuel infrastructure. Fossil fuel interests are still here in our own capital, writing regulation on environmental policy. And it's time that we stand up to them. And we can only really do that if we reject any sort of contributions from anyone affiliated with them. My opponent has benefited from thousands of dollars from Chevron themselves, who have a refinery across the bay in the Richmond. This is not in the district, but it does affect our entire Bay Area. And the residents there have been complaining for years and years of air pollution. You can literally see the plumes all the way from here in San Francisco from that refinery. And not even to mention our oceans. We're a peninsula, and so we're surrounded by it. But, you know, it also involves dismantling the fossil fuel infrastructure that exists, moratorium on any new permits for those for fossil fuel infrastructure. Returning indigenous lands to indigenous hands, ensuring that communities have access to fresh food and community land trusts to fight food deserts. It also means building not just any housing near public transportation, but deeply affordable housing for low-income people and middle-income people. It also means investing severely in our drastically cut public transportation. So many agencies are struggling to keep up with even half service right now. And our transportation sector has been responsible for 40% of our emissions over California. And so any part of a Green New Deal, the spearhead must be investing in public transportation. Now, there exists special interests in there too, because we have rideshare companies and car companies who throw millions of dollars into campaigns. I'm proud to not accept any dime from any of them. And my opponent is well funded by rideshare companies, other car companies like Ford and GM. And it's time that we also tax the billionaires who, as we know, contribute so much to climate change just with hoarding wealth, extracting wealth from the earth and its resources, and redistributing those funds to preserve lands, to protect communities, to invest in the health of our people, which also has a big hand in protecting the environment.
Right on. On the just transition component to that, because I think most everybody agrees with what you're saying, but then you always get that the workers kind of thing, right? So I always like to underscore that just transition component. Can you do so?
Yeah, what a just transition means is we need to transition. It's not going to be overnight. Actually, something that my opponent and I agree on is the public takeover of PG&E, but there are some details in his plan that I would disagree with around giving communities power over those utility companies, and issues and concerns around equity and frontline communities. A just transition means we are providing jobs for the workers who are currently employed in the fossil fuel industry. It also means that we are addressing issues of racial injustice and economic violence that often contribute even more to climate change. So displacement and redevelopment here in our district has looked like pushing thousands of poor people and people of color across the Bay to commute 2 hours to city centers to their jobs. This is not sustainable for those people or for our planet. And so what we need to do is center those communities that have been marginalized for so long and ensure that they are housed and that those injustices are remedied. And so I would say that a just transition includes protecting frontline communities as well as protecting workers. A just transition also needs to center the rights and needs of Indigenous people. So, before settler colonialism, it was millions of Indigenous people protecting these lands in what we now know as the United States. And even here in California, I am Native American, I'm not California Indian, I'm Lakota and Hidatsa, but there are still tribes here in California up and down the state who have fought to preserve their sacred sites, who have known for a long time the various wildfire corridors, and they just know how to live in a symbiotic relationship with the land. And we have a lot to learn from them. It is found over and over that scientists in these studies confirm a lot of Indigenous knowledge that has been passed on for millennia. And so a just transition also needs to center Indigenous voices. I will also say that it also needs to remedy the historic injustices of environmental racism. So that also looks like providing jobs for communities that have been disinvested from. Here in the Bayview, there's been a shipyard, and it's been a decades-long controversy because the Navy dumped this toxic waste from Bikini Atoll, nuclear waste. And now that community is facing unprecedented, disproportionate levels of cancer, of asthma, of the most horrendous respiratory and skin conditions. And it's no shock to that community. They've been crying and jumping every single month, really, about this issue. And state leaders, for some reason, just won't hold the Navy or the housing and real estate developers accountable who want to dig up that soil. And so cleaning up the shipyard and Baby Hunters Point is also a big priority for me.
Yeah. And one thing you mentioned in there was the workers going out of town for employment, right?
Oh, I can't hear you.
I don't know. Yeah. Can you hear me now? Oh, looks like we lost audio. I can hear you. Let me try adding her back in. Can you hear me now? Hello, hello. Can you hear me now? Hello, hello. All right, looks like we lost audio. I'm not sure quite what happened there.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Oh. Well, how about you type in questions to the chat?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right, there we go. Cool. I had to put my glasses on. That was the trick. Well, the thing I was going to say, you mentioned workers that have to go out of town to find employment, right? What that also does is that shifts the tax base, right? So it benefits the suburbs and actually harms the inner city area where they're coming from as well, right? There's so many knock-on, negative effects of things like that, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of unintended consequences of redevelopment, and it's often looked like, communities of color and poor communities facing the worst impacts.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let me just kind of hit on two more things, and then I'll let you go. Just highlight one other thing that the incumbent has done directly from a donor to a vote that has adversely affected California 11.
One of the most egregious examples is in November of 2018, our city in San Francisco was considering a ballot measure to put a small tax on the wealthiest corporations, including Salesforce, Square, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, and the Chamber of Commerce here vehemently opposed this, as did the Square CEO, which is Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Twitter as well. And Scott Wiener, my opponent at that time, was one of a handful of leaders that had opposed it. And now this tax was going to fund hundreds of millions of dollars worth of permanent housing and supportive services for the more than 9,000 people who are homeless in San Francisco. Mind you, we also have at this point in time about 1,400 homeless San Francisco Unified students. We're talking students that are homeless and still going to school. And so, my opponent, for some reason, opposed this, and it needed a 2/3 vote to be non-controversial. At that time, we had thought that 50% was going to be enough. We still maintain that. And it passed with 60% of the electorate. Had my opponent supported it, we probably could have gotten to the 67% threshold and barred any challenges in court. And at this point in time, the funds are literally being collected. They are sitting there in city coffers. We just haven't spent them because the Taxpayer Association and the Chamber of Commerce and all those companies and individuals that oppose this measure are now fighting this in court. And what do we have now? A pandemic where homeless people are left out of shelters because of obviously the congregate situation, exposing them to coronavirus. And we have even more people sleeping out on our streets. It's unsafe. It's unsanitary. It's an abomination, an embarrassing blemish on our city's consciousness. And so I think that was a really big motivation for me running as well, because I had experienced housing insecurity. I know plenty of people who have as well. And at this point in time, we could be housing those people in either hotel rooms or other permanent forms of housing. And obviously that's not going to get rid of all their problems, but it is a huge part. And meanwhile, he's been advocating for navigation centers, but there's nothing to navigate them to. And so it's just been an uphill battle when it comes to funding real solutions for homelessness and this particular state senator.
Yeah. Yeah, you mentioned, egregious, and particularly even more so because we're on the precipice of an eviction crisis, right? Like at the end of this month. So awesome, Jackie. I'm all on board with your platform. How can people help? Where do you need help?
We are an entirely grassroots funded organization, and we're seeing, even today, it's so exciting to see amazing candidates in New York get elected who are open democratic socialists, who are not beholden to corporations or special interests. And so we are part of that larger movement. There's not a single democratic socialist in the California legislature. We have barely one renter in the California legislature. And if elected, I could be the first Indigenous woman ever elected to the California legislature. This ultimately is about the future of West Coast politics. This is where, Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi came out of, Senator Kamala Harris, our current governor, Gavin Newsom, and Scott Wiener wants to be among them. He cannot do that as long as he has built his entire career on siding with corporations, siding with real estate developers against real solutions to fight police impunity, to fight homelessness, to fight affordability, housing crisis. We need someone who is accountable to everyday people, and it's people like you that can make it happen. Whether you have $5 or $10, the maximum is $4,700, so it's basically limitless in our world. And we would appreciate anything that you can chip in our way. You can go to JackieForSenate.com and check out there.
Right on. And it's a solidly blue. It's two Democrats, and it's a progressive district. Like, why would you not want the fightingest fighter in that seat, right? No more corporate puppets. Let's get some fighters in there, uncorrupted fighters. So
Absolutely.
Godspeed, Jackie. Yeah, and thank you for all your activism heretofore, and thank you for running. Again, the election's on November 3rd, Jackie for Senate. I'd love to talk to you again before then, try to contribute to any momentum before then if I can. So, Godspeed. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me, and thanks for the patience on the technical issues.
Thank you so much, Eric. I appreciate it.
Right on. Talk to you soon. Thank you.
Talk to you later.